Okay, let's continue with our special topics on research ethics. This is Module 8, working with vulnerable populations. We said before, according to the many stipulations made in all those historical documents, the Nuremberg Code, the Helsinki Declaration, and the Belmont Report, a basic principle or ethical principle in research with human subjects is to have respect for persons, your prospective subjects. Um, this principle must be held um, regardless of the population you're working with. But this principle is particularly important when you're working with populations that might be disadvantaged in certain aspects. And we'll be talking about two in this module. The first case is when you're working with prisoners. The second case is when you're working with children. These two populations, when they're potential subjects of research, are disadvantaged in different aspects. Prisoners, you can imagine, they are under confinement for different purposes, and they're in fact under a tremendous amount of pressure and duress if someone from the establishment, so to speak, from, for example, federal research institution, um, they these prisoners they might feel obliged or compelled to cooperate when in fact they have the rights certainly to refuse to participate. Children, on the other hand, for a simple reason, they might not have yet the level of maturity to judge the potential risks and benefits, even when those risks and benefits are explicitly described in consent forms. In other words, children, when or before they have attained their legal age, do not have do not have the ability to give informed consent. Even when they sign on your consent form, that consent form is in fact void, because the children's ability to comprehend your language is in serious question. So that's why these two, working with these two populations present challenges for researchers. And of course, there are other vulnerable populations such as pregnant women, or the homeless, or the economically challenged populations. But due to the limits and scope of this module, we're going to use these two populations as examples. Let's start with the case of working with prisoners. Per federal definition, prisoners refer to persons involuntarily confined or detained in a penal institution. They're either sentenced to such an institution under criminal or civil law, or they're detained pending arraignment, trial, or sentencing. In fact, the country or the federal law allows prisoners to be involved in research, but federal regulations have very strict definitions or stipulations with regard to what type of research prisoners are allowed to participate in. Specifically, there are four types of research that the federal regulations consider appropriate for prisoners to be involved, provided that the studies which fall in any of the four categories present no more than minimal risk and present no more than minimal inconvenience to prisoner subjects. The first category of research that the federal regulation allows prisoners to be participants are studies of the possible causes, effects, and processes, psychological, for example, of incarceration and criminal behavior. An example of this research, this type of research, is a study on the correlation between, the person suffering abuse when the person is a child, and later on the person um, is incarcerated as a prisoner. In other words, this study tries to find out um, whether or not childhood experience is related to later on behaviors that might cause the person legal problems. So this study is will be allowed given that the study meets other RRB approval criteria. The second type of study that federal regulations allow prisoners to participate in are studies of prisons as institutional structure, that is, to evaluate prisons, certain aspects of prisons, or studies on prisoners as incarcerated persons. What does that mean? So, a research study on the impact of services provided in a state prison facilities, that's okay, because this research project evaluates state prison as an institutional structure, a state prison as a state institution in this case, or evaluate how these services impact prisoners. That will also be okay, right? So an impact of services on prisoners as incarcerated persons. So this is the second category of study or research that federal regulations allow prisoner subjects to participate in. The third type of research is a little bit more sensitive than the previous two. This is research on the conditions particularly affecting prisoners as a class, right? So the seniors are a class of people. The children are a class of people. Here, the prisoners are a class of people. This type of study needs to meet more stringent approval conditions. This type of study, in other words, must be approved by the Secretary of the Health and Human Services, him herself, before it can be executed. In other words, RRB approval is not sufficient for this type of research. The Secretary of Health and Human Services needs also to approve the study on top of RRB approval. So, for example, if a researcher is interested in the social and psychological problems associated with prisoners per se, such as alcoholism, drug addiction, and sexual assaults, certainly this study is allowed, but it needs to be evaluated by the Secretary of HHS other than RRB. The last type of research that can be conducted with prisoners are studies on the practices, both innovative and accepted, which have the intent and possibility of improving the health or well-being of prisoner subjects. So again, because these type of studies could have impact, even though it's positive impact for sure, physically or psychologically have on prisoners subjects, the study also needs the approval of the Secretary of HHS, him or herself. So for example, depression is presumably a big problem in prisons, so a researcher is interested in testing out his or her innovative behavioral intervention to alleviate depressive symptoms on prisoner subjects. So that's a great cause. I think that's a wonderful idea. But because the nature of such intervention, right, it might have psychological, or it purports to have psychological and even sometimes physical impact on the prisoners. The the study will need approval of Secretary of HHS, and RRB. Okay. All right. The second case we're going to talk about today is working with children. Again, similar to prisoners, the federal regulations have very clear definition on what, who counts as children. So children are persons who have not yet attained the legal age of consent. In many states, that age, the age of majority, is 18 years old, but in some other states, such as Nebraska, that age is 19. But we should also be aware of the fact that the legal age of consent or age of majority are different across countries. Some are 21, for example, I think in China. So research with children is undoubtedly very valuable because childhood is such an important period of time in terms of human development that many psychological programs start to unpack and have impact on people, on adult life. So definitely research with children is valuable, and RRB stipulates that some research projects with children may be exempt. That is, these research will receive exempt review, right? It does not say that these research studies will not be reviewed. They will still be reviewed, but they will receive exempt review faster. For example, when such research projects involve the observation of public behavior in which the researcher does not participate. In other words, the researcher in such a study will only observe but does not intervene. A second type of exempt review study will be normal educational practices conducted in established or commonly accepted educational settings, such as, certified teachers teaching in school. That's okay. The use of educational testing, for example, all the standardized test instruments applied to children, SAT, whatever, so those can be allowed. But the following types of research will not be exempt or may not be exempt when because they involve, for example, researchers interviewing with children, asking children questions. That is, there are interactions with children, surveys of children. If you recall, this is actually an intervention because children will be receiving some type of questionnaires, either online or paper and pencil questionnaires. So this intervention, or researchers observing children, but in those observations, the researcher will participate in the activities observed. What does that mean? Let's look at some examples. So for example, if I tell you as an exam, a researcher observes children on a school playground, so public setting, to determine whether children prefer playmates of their own ethnicity, so in-group preferences. So would this research be exempt or not exempt? It's going to be exempt because in this case, first of all, the research will take place in a public setting, educational setting, and in this case, the researcher only observes but does not intervene, so exempt. However, if the researcher interviews children on a school playground, still public educational setting, to determine their preferred playmates, will this research be exempt? No, because this research involves interviews. So whenever there are interactions or interventions between the researcher and children, the study is unlikely to be exempt. Example 3, an anthropologist observes foreign children learning English in a rural village to assess language acquisition. Will this study be exempt? Yes, it will be because, again, this is a public setting, even though not necessarily educational, but more importantly, the researcher only observes but does not intervene. However, if that anthropologist volunteers to teach, so this person is not a teacher, right? So that's not a, regular or common or ordinary teaching activity. So this is a researcher, but he or she volunteers to teach English in that rural village, and at the same time, the anthropologist records observations of language acquisition in the children. So this study would not be exempt because it's not normal educational activities. Second, there are participation, right, in the observation, because this guy not only observes, but this person is actively involved in the activity that this researcher observes. So this research project will not receive exam review, but likely will go to full board. Okay, so that will be our module on research ethics today. See you tomorrow.